Hiroshi didn't mean to stay so late. He had lost track of time practicing with his school's kendo club, and by the time he stepped out of the gym, the sun had nearly disappeared. The campus was eerily silent, the usual chatter of students replaced by the distant hum of cicadas. He quickened his pace, heading toward the school gate. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, rolling in from the streets and curling around the base of the flickering streetlights. As he reached the main road, he noticed how empty it was. No cars, no pedestrians, just an unsettling stillness. Then he heard it, the rhythmic sound of wooden sandals on pavement. Hiroshi froze. The noise was coming from a narrow alleyway just ahead. His grip tightened around the strap of his backpack as a figure emerged from the mist. A woman in a long beige coat, her head tilted slightly downward. The glow of a street lamp revealed a white surgical mask covering her lower face. Her long, dark hair obscured one eye, but the visible one fixed on him with an unnatural stillness. "Do you think I'm beautiful?" she whispered. The words slithered into his ears like a cold breath. Hiroshi's pulse hammered against his ribs. His parents had told him ghost stories when he was a kid, stories about something like this: a woman in a mask, a question with no right answer. Still, he had to say something. "Yes," he stammered, hoping to appease her. For a moment, she was silent. Then, slowly, her gloved hand reached up. With a deliberate motion, she peeled away the mask. Beneath it, her mouth was carved into a horrific, permanent grin. Jagged, unnatural, stretching from ear to ear. The edges of the wound were raw and glistening, as if freshly cut. Her teeth were small and uneven, far too many for a normal mouth. "How about now?" she murmured, her voice distorted by her grotesque smile. Hiroshi staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The woman took a step closer, the gaiter on her feet clicking against the pavement. In sheer panic, Hiroshi hurled the only thing he had, a half-empty soda bottle. It struck her shoulder and bounced off harmlessly, but in that split second, he regained control of his legs. He turned and bolted, heart pounding so hard it drowned out all other sounds. He didn't dare look back. By the time he reached his house, his lungs burned, and his hands were shaking too much to fit his key into the lock. When he finally stumbled inside, he slammed the door shut and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. That night, he barely slept. Every shadow in his room seemed to shift, and every creak of the house made him jolt upright. The next morning, he hesitated before leaving for school, but convinced himself that he had imagined the whole thing. Stress, exhaustion, maybe a prank. But when he arrived at the school gate, a crowd had gathered. "Hey, isn't that Hiroshi's?" someone murmured. His stomach dropped as he pushed through the students. Lying at the entrance was his backpack. It had been slashed in half, the fabric sliced cleanly as if by a razor-sharp blade. A chill crept up his spine. He hadn't dropped it last night. He had made it home with it, which meant someone or something had come back for him, and it knew where he belonged. Mika had always preferred night shifts. Fewer patients, less noise, and a strange sense of peace in the dimly lit corridors of the rural clinic where she worked. But something about that night felt off. The silence was heavier than usual, pressing against her ears. The air felt thick, almost stagnant, like the whole building was holding its breath. At 3 a.m. the front door chimed weakly. Mika looked up from her paperwork and froze. A woman stood in the entrance, swaying slightly. Her long, dark hair clung to her face, dripping with something thick and dark. A ragged beige coat wrapped around her thin frame, the fabric darkened by what looked like fresh blood. One hand clutched her face, fingers digging into her skin as though she were trying to hold something in place. "Please, help me," the woman rasped. Mika swallowed hard, but quickly regained her composure. This was a hospital. People came in injured all the time. "Mom, let's get you checked out," Mika said, guiding her to an examination room. The woman didn't resist, but Mika couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The way the woman moved, stiff, jerky, like a puppet being forced along by invisible strings. Her breath rattled, uneven and hollow. Mika led her to a chair and reached for a fresh pair of gloves. "Can you tell me what happened?" The woman sat rigidly before slowly turning her head toward Mika. Her hand trembled as she lifted it from her face. "Am I beautiful?" she asked. Mika blinked. Of course," she answered instinctively. The woman let out a low, shuddering sigh. Then, in one swift motion, she dropped her hand completely. Mika's stomach lurched. The woman's mouth wasn't just a mouth. It was a gaping wound, stretching from ear to ear, her lips curling into a grotesque, jagged grin. Torn flesh exposed rows of two sharp teeth, the corners of her mouth still oozing fresh blood. The skin around her jaw looked as though it had been forcibly cut, jagged and uneven, like someone had taken a dull blade to it. Mika stumbled backward, heart hammering. The woman leaned forward. "Even now," she whispered. A memory surfaced, an old urban legend Mika had heard as a child. Kuchisake-onna, the Slit-Mouthed Woman, a vengeful spirit that appeared at night, asking unsuspecting victims if they thought she was beautiful. If they said no, she killed them. If they said yes, she made them match her. Mika's training kicked in. In a desperate move, she reached into her pocket and flung the only thing she had, hard candies from the break room. The colorful sweets scattered across the floor, clinking against the cold tiles. For a moment, the woman's eyes darted down. She hesitated. Her breathing grew erratic, as if she was fighting an invisible force. Mika seized the opportunity. She lunged for the door, yanking it open and slamming it shut behind her. Hands shaking, she locked it and pressed her back against the cold metal. Silence, then scratching. Long, deliberate, scraping noises against the inside of the door. A slow, methodical skirt. Skirt, skirt. Mika squeezed her eyes shut. Her breath came in shallow gasps. A sudden, sharp knock made her jump. She bolted down the hallway, nearly colliding with the security guard. There's someone in the room," she panted, pointing. She was hurt, but the guard frowned, nodding toward the closed door. "In there," Mika nodded, unable to speak. The guard stepped forward, keycard in hand. He swiped it. The lock clicked open. The room was empty. No blood, no woman, no sign that anyone had been there, except for the deep, jagged scratch marks covering the walls and the pile of untouched candies scattered on the floor. Mika didn't work the night shift again. Kenji had been a taxi driver for nearly 15 years, but he had never picked up a passenger from a place as ominous as this. It was past midnight when he spotted her standing near the edge of Okigahara Forest, her silhouette barely illuminated by his headlights. She wore a beige trench coat, buttoned up to her neck, and a white surgical mask, like many in the city did during flu season. Her long black hair hung limply over her shoulders, and despite the chill in the air, she stood completely still, waiting. Kenji hesitated. No one willingly walked near Aokigahara this late. He had heard the stories, the ones about lost souls and eerie whispers among the trees. But work was work. He pulled up beside her, rolling down the window slightly. "Need a ride?" he asked. The woman nodded without a word and slid into the back seat. Kenji adjusted the meter. "Where to?" She whispered an address on the outskirts of Tokyo, far from any major roads. It was an unfamiliar route, but he punched it into his GPS and started driving. The silence in the cab was suffocating. He checked the mirror, expecting her to be looking out the window, but she was staring directly at him. A deep discomfort settled in his chest. After a few minutes, the woman finally spoke. "Do I look pretty?" Her voice was hollow, like it echoed from somewhere far away. Kenji swallowed hard. He had heard of urban legends about women asking this question, ghost stories about vengeful spirits who roamed the streets, seeking validation, or something worse. He forced a nervous chuckle. Sure. You look fine." The woman's head tilted slightly. "Fine?" Kenji gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I mean, you look good," he corrected himself. The air inside the cab felt heavier. The woman exhaled, a strange, rattling sound. "Good," she repeated, almost mockingly. They continued down the deserted road, the lights of the city far behind them. The trees on either side loomed taller, their branches curling like skeletal fingers toward the sky. The GPS lost signal. Then, Kenji saw something in the mirror. Her surgical mask had slipped slightly, revealing the edge of her mouth. His stomach twisted. Her lips were torn wide, stretching unnaturally far, exposing the raw, jagged flesh of her cheeks. He forced himself to look back at the road, his pulse hammering in his throat. The woman shifted in her seat. "Do I still look pretty?" Her voice had changed. It was deeper now, almost inhuman. Kenji broke into a cold sweat. His mind screamed at him to say yes, but fear made him stutter. "No, you're average." The temperature in the cab plummeted. The woman let out a slow, guttural hiss. "Average?" The doors locked with a sharp click. Kenji's heart nearly stopped. His grip tightened on the wheel as he floored the gas pedal, but the cab wouldn't accelerate. It was as if something was holding it back. A whisper slithered through the car. "Liar!" The rearview mirror cracked as if something had struck it from the inside. The woman's reflection wasn't hers anymore. Her mouth had split from ear to ear, revealing rows of sharpened teeth. Her eyes were black voids locked onto his. Kenji slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching against the asphalt. With shaking hands, he fumbled to unlock the door, but the mechanism was jammed. A low chuckle echoed from behind him. Desperate, Kenji grabbed a rock from the roadside and smashed the driver's side window. Glass rained over him as he forced himself through the jagged opening, cutting his hands and arms in the process. The woman let out an inhuman shriek. Kenji ran. He ran harder than he ever had in his life, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't dare look back, not even when he heard the distant sound of the taxi's engine revving on its own. He ran for what felt like hours, blindly stumbling down the road until headlights appeared in the distance. A trucker pulled over, shouting in alarm, when he saw Kenji's bloody hands and wild eyes. By the time they returned to where the taxi had stopped, it was gone. The police found the cab 2 days later, abandoned deep in the woods. The interior was in ruins. The back seat was shredded beyond recognition, deep claw marks etched into the leather. The doors were still locked, yet no trace of the woman was ever found. But they did find one thing, the cracked rearview mirror, and in its reflection, they swore they saw a twisted smile, watching. Aiko sat at her tiny wooden desk, eyes straining at her laptop screen as she revised her history paper. The glow of the monitor cast long shadows against the walls of her cramped apartment. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the frost-covered window. Sapporo winters were unforgiving, and tonight was no exception. Then came the knock, soft at first, just 3 gentle taps. Aiko froze, her fingers poised over the keyboard. Her heart pounded. It was midnight. No one visited at this hour. Another knock, this time harder. She swallowed, cautiously rising from her chair. Barefoot, she padded toward the door, her breath visible in the icy air. Pressing her eye to the peephole, she saw someone standing just outside. A woman. Her figure was slightly hunched, her long black hair spilling over her shoulders. A pale surgical mask covered the lower half of her face. "Let me in." The voice was hushed, hoarse, as if forced through clenched teeth. "I need to ask you something." Aiko's stomach twisted. Something about the woman's presence felt wrong. Then her phone buzzed, a news alert. She glanced down at the glowing screen. Kuchisake-onna sighted in Hokkaido. Stay indoors. Aiko felt lightheaded. Kuchisake-onna, the Slit-Mouthed Woman. The urban legend she had heard as a child. The spirit of a mutilated woman who roamed the streets, asking strangers a single question. Am I beautiful? If you answered yes, she would remove her mask, revealing a grotesque, ear-to-ear grin, sliced open with a blade. Then she would carve your face to match. If you answered no, she would kill you on the spot. The knocking turned into frantic pounding. Bam! 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 Am I beautiful? The woman shrieked from the other side of the door. Aiko's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the doorknob with trembling hands, forcing herself to think. She remembered the trick, one her grandmother had told her long ago. "You're average," Aiko shouted, her voice barely steady. Silence. The knocking stopped. The air in the apartment turned deathly still. Aiko pressed herself against the door, listening. Nothing. Minutes passed, then an hour. She stood there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The night dragged on, and exhaustion finally overtook her. She sank to the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. At dawn, weak sunlight filtered through the frosted window. Gathering her courage, she reached up and slowly turned the lock. The door creaked open. The hallway was empty, but the wood of the door was ruined. Deep claw marks gouged into its surface, like something had tried to tear its way inside. Her breath hitched, and then she saw it. A single, long black hair tangled in the splinters. Aiko slammed the door shut, locking every bolt. She never slept by the entrance again. That night, she deleted the news app from her phone. Some stories were better left unread. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. 3 friends, Daichi, Riku, and Sota, had planned a hiking and camping excursion deep in the mountains of Nagano, away from the suffocating bustle of Tokyo. They had read about an old, abandoned shrine hidden along the trail, and decided it would be a perfect place to explore before heading back. The shrine stood in eerie silence, half consumed by nature. The wooden torii gate was rotting, its paint peeling like dead skin. Stone lanterns, cracked and weathered, lined the path leading to the altar, where a broken statue of a woman stood. Its face had been shattered, leaving only a jagged hole where the mouth should be. A cold wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves with an almost human sigh. "This place gives me the creeps," Riku muttered, shifting his backpack. "Relax, man. It's just old," Sota replied, kicking a rock down the path. "Bet no one's been here in decades." Daichi, the most superstitious of the three, hesitated before stepping closer to the altar. "We shouldn't be here," he said. "They say shrines like this were abandoned because something unnatural happened." Riku scoffed. "You sound like my grandmother." They took a few pictures, laughed about ghost stories, and started their hike back down as the sky darkened. Twilight settled over the forest, stretching the shadows long and thin. That was when they saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the path, her back slightly hunched, her long, tangled black hair hanging over her face. She wore a faded kimono, the fabric torn and smeared with dirt. Her head twitched slightly, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The three friends froze. Then, in a raspy voice, she spoke. "Tell me, am I beautiful?" Riku and Sota chuckled uneasily. "Sure, lady," Riku said, forcing a grin. Without warning, the woman straightened. Her fingers trembled as they reached for her face. Slowly, she peeled off a white surgical mask, revealing a mouth slashed open from ear to ear. The torn flesh curled upward in a grotesque smile, exposing jagged, yellowed teeth. Blood, fresh and glistening, dripped onto her chin. Sota stumbled back. "Oh shit!" The woman lunged. The three bolted in different directions. Daichi ran blindly through the woods, heart pounding. Branches whipped against his face, his lungs burning. Behind him, he could hear the frantic footsteps of his friends, but the sounds grew distant. Then, a scream. Not just any scream. A raw, guttural wail that sliced through the trees like a blade. It was Sota. Daichi turned, panting. He could barely make out the shapes moving in the dark, but he knew Sota was no longer running. Something had caught him. Then silence. "Shit, shit, shit," Daichi whispered, trying to keep moving. Ahead, he saw Riku sprinting, his eyes wide with terror. "Run, Daichi," he shouted. But before Daichi could react, something grabbed his ankle. He crashed to the ground, his breath knocked out of him. Looking down, he saw that his leg was caught in a nest of twisted roots. He clawed at the dirt, trying to free himself. Then he saw the shadow. She was standing over him. The woman. Her dark eyes gleamed, and in her hand, she held something that caught the moonlight. Scissors, rusted, old, but sharp. Daichi's screams echoed through the trees. Weeks later, rescue teams found 2 bodies deep in the forest. Riku had been discovered first, his throat slit so deeply that his head was nearly severed. His body was curled in a fetal position, as if he had died screaming. Daichi was found near a cluster of gnarled roots, his face frozen in a twisted, grotesque grin. His mouth had been cut from ear to ear, stitched crudely at the edges with strands of dark hair. Sota was never found. Some say that if you walk the same trail at twilight, you might hear his voice calling from the woods, whispering a single question. "Am I beautiful?"